Welcome to The Explainer, and a big hello to all the law students and legal pros tuning in. Today, we're tackling a Latin maxim that, let's be honest, you've probably heard and wondered, what on earth is that about? I'm talking about res inter alios acta. It sounds incredibly important, but does it actually do anything useful in a modern courtroom? Well, let's find out.
So what's it all mean? Well, boiled down, the idea is that a deal or a transaction between two people shouldn't be allowed to hurt a third person who wasn't involved. And, on its face, that sounds pretty reasonable, right? Fair enough. But as you're about to see, this nice, simple phrase has caused a whole world of confusion. It's definitely not the powerful legal weapon you might think it is.
And you gotta understand, this wasn't always some dusty old saying. For a very long time, res inter alios acta was actually seen as a cornerstone of evidence law. It was like a main gatekeeper deciding what a court could and couldn't hear. But that was then, and this is now. Its role has shrunk dramatically.
All right, so let's start taking a closer look at this old foundation. And right away, we hit the first and maybe the biggest problem with it. As just a general statement about how the world works, the maxim is, well, it's just plain wrong.
And this brings us to an absolutely killer point from the legal scholar Sir James Stephen. He points out something that, once you hear it, feels completely obvious. Of course we're affected by what other people do. Just think about it for a second. A company files for bankruptcy, that's a transaction between them and their creditors, but it sure affects the employees, right? Or two people get married. That affects their kids, their parents, their whole community. Our lives are constantly being shaped by things we had no part in.
And this is really the maxim's fatal flaw. It's a label, it's not an explanation. It just tells you that something might be irrelevant, but it gives you zero principle, no actual test for figuring out why. It's like putting up a keep out sign, but forgetting to build the fence. It just doesn't help a judge make that critical call between what's truly irrelevant and what's actually important evidence.
So where does that leave us today in modern law? Let's look at 3 common areas where you might still hear this phrase pop up, and in every single one, you'll see it's basically a ghost. The real legal work is being done by other, much better, much more specific rules.
This table just lays it all out so clearly. Think about trying to bring up someone's prior misconduct. A court doesn't block that because of some fancy Latin. It's weighing how relevant it is against how prejudicial it might be. Same thing with hearsay, or using a prior judgment. In every single case, the maxim is just this clumsy, old-fashioned label for a much sharper, more modern rule that's actually doing the job.
So let's stick with that example. When a judge says, nope, you can't bring up what the defendant did 5 years ago, they're thinking about real, practical issues. They're asking, is this actually relevant to the case at hand, or is it just a distraction? Is this going to poison the jury's mind against the defendant unfairly? Are we about to get totally sidetracked with a whole mini-trial about something else entirely? The vague idea of a transaction between others just doesn't help answer any of those crucial questions.
And this is where it starts to get pretty absurd. I mean, if you actually took this maxim literally, you'd have to throw out huge amounts of perfectly good, totally necessary evidence. How do you prove you own a piece of land? Well, you show the deed from the person you bought it from. How does an expert witness prove they're an expert? They talk about their experience working for other people and other companies. A literal reading of this rule would make proving even the most basic things totally impossible.
Now, to see the real-world danger of getting this wrong, we have to look at a classic English case. It is the perfect cautionary tale. It shows exactly what happens when a court leans on a dusty old maxim instead of on solid legal principles. So, the facts are pretty straightforward. A ship sinks in the River Thames. The owner's crew does the right thing. They go straight to the harbor master to report the wreck. The harbor master says, "Got it, I'll get a warning light placed on it." But he never does. And later that night, another boat comes along and slams right into the unlit wreck.
So now the owner of the sunken ship gets sued for negligence. At trial, they try to introduce evidence of that conversation with the harbor master, to prove that they did their duty, that they tried to prevent another accident. So, what do you think? If you were the judge, would you let that evidence in?
You're not going to believe this. The trial judge said no. He blocked the evidence. And his reasoning? Pure, unthinking res inter alios acta.
He called it a conversation that happened behind the back of the person who was suing. He just mechanically applied the maxim without ever stopping to ask the most important question. What was this evidence actually trying to prove?
Thankfully, the Court of Appeals saw just how wrong this was. They overturned the decision, and they didn't mince words. They called the judge's ruling a disastrous consequence of misusing the maxim. See, the evidence wasn't being offered to prove that the harbor master's promise was true. It was being offered to prove the act of reporting the wreck, an act that was absolutely central to figuring out whether the ship's owner had been negligent or not.
That shipwreck case just nails it, doesn't it? It shows exactly why we have to move past these old Latin phrases and start asking a real, functional question when we're deciding what evidence to admit. So, what is that question?
You know, the story of this maxim really follows this huge shift in legal thinking. We've moved away from this rigid, almost robotic approach that's obsessed with who was in the room, and we've moved toward a modern, principled approach that focuses on one thing above all else.
So what is that one thing? After all of this, what does it all boil down to? It comes down to a single, incredibly powerful question that just cuts through all the confusion.
This is it. This is the whole ball game. This is the question that matters. Forget the Latin. Forget who was there and who wasn't. Just ask, for what purpose are we offering this piece of evidence? Is it to prove that a statement is true, or just to prove that the statement was made? Is it to establish someone's character, or to show their state of mind? The purpose is everything. The purpose is what defines relevance.
So at the end of the day, res inter alios acta is best seen as a historical contributor. It's an important ancestor to our modern rules of evidence, like the hearsay rule. But it is not a functional, working tool for a lawyer today. Think of it like a part of the legal family tree, but it's not an active member of the household anymore.
So here's the big takeaway. For anyone studying or practicing law, clinging to this maxim is a trap. It's exactly what led that trial judge in the shipwreck case down the wrong path. The real legal skill isn't about reciting Latin phrases. It's about being able to cut through the noise, identify the purpose of the evidence, and argue from first principles. So really, isn't it time we let this one finally rest in peace? Thanks for watching.